It's 1914, and the world is about to fucking explode. Nations all around the world ready their massive armies for good old-fashioned bloodletting, each hoping to get some slices from the inevitable victory pie when everything is said and done. One of these nations is an upstart new kid on the block, the Empire of Japan, who is ready to truly put themselves on the world stage through some participation in a global conflict. Now, Japan has been having a whale of a time joyriding through East Asia, kicking the shit out of literally all of their neighbors. They ate a bunch of islands, then Korea, and also parts of China. Then Russia rolls up, understandably a little miffed about being upstage, and then tries to start shit. Japan then proceeds to bend them over and humiliate them in a war, which gives them even more land. However, Japan is still hungry, and the only country that they were not locked in a truce timer with at that point was Germany, who happened to also have a bunch of islands and a very tempting port in China, which Japan thought should be theirs as well. This port was called Tsingtao, modern-day Qingdao, nestled neatly on the Shandong Peninsula in the northeast of the country. Japan wanted it, and as is tradition in the 20th century, they were prepared to fight for it. Germany at that time was also an empire and also wanted to eat things, so they leased, quote unquote, it was mostly at gunpoint, the area in 1898 because it was the hip thing to bully China at the time, and basically built the city and its port to serve as a pretty neat base for the East Asia Squadron. Overall, the city would actually be quite prosperous under the Germans, even having its own beer brewing company, which was a pretty good sign of their presence. After the Boxer Rebellion and the Japanese attack on Port Arthur, they elected to fortify the place to hell to prevent anything similar. However, despite this, if it were to be attacked, there would be little the mainland could do to help given its geographic distance. The troops defending the city were commanded by one Alfred Mayer Waldeck, the governor of the area, who would try to make the best of a pretty shit situation. It only takes two to tango, but of course it wouldn't be a date without the awkward third wheel. Britain and Japan had a nice little alliance designed to keep Russia from being a meme and trying anything, but now that Germany was fucking around in Europe, the Brits could call Japan along for the ride, with the aim of taking all of the far-flung German possessions in Asia so they wouldn't be a problem. And this is exactly what they did. On August 15th, the Japanese sent a demand to tell the Germans to basically go away and give up the port, and when this was obviously refused, Japan declared war and immediately began preparing to take the place by force. The Germans knew pretty well that holding the East was basically impossible in the event of a war with Britain, so much of the East Asia Squadron had already dipped in an attempt to get back to Europe. So when the Japanese and British ships showed up on August 27th to blockade the port, they were not met with much resistance, other than that of various shore artillery batteries that were in place. The attackers brought along a fair few ships, primarily a bunch of dreadnought and pre-dreadnought battleships, but their force also included a seaplane tender, which was basically a proto-aircraft carrier, the IJN Wakamiya. Meanwhile, Japan began landing troops on September 2nd, but not in the port itself, instead deciding to violate Chinese neutrality by a landing near the city of Longkao, which was on the north of the peninsula. Basically dropped over 23,000 men in China and dared them to do anything, which they wouldn't. The British, of course, wouldn't be left out, and sent a small force of about 1,500 men to go help out, just so that they could say they were there and it wasn't just Japan doing the work.
Meanwhile,
The Germans, meanwhile, decided to get all their men in the city. Their ragtag defensive force consisted mainly of Marines and sailors, along with some conscripted Chinese troops and even some very unfortunate Austro-Hungarian sailors who happened to be stuck there with their ship, the SMS Kaiserin Elizabeth. Altogether, they had about 3,600 men in a couple of ships, mainly gunboats and the aforementioned Austro-Hungarian ship. They did also have a plane, flown by Gunther Pluschow, which could be used for reconnaissance or harassment. The numbers were definitely not in their favor, but this didn't seem to concern the big man in Berlin, who wanted the city held, going as far as to say it would shame me more to surrender Tsingtao to the Japanese than Berlin to the Russians. Germans made best use of their smaller numbers by creating a tight defensive ring around the town, centered on the hills overlooking it, using heavy fortifications to make themselves a very unappealing target. Luck also seemed to be on their side, at least temporarily, and first blood would go to them, with one of the gunboats sinking a Japanese destroyer that got stuck in a bad spot, no doubt being captained by your average World of Warships player. The Japanese would retaliate over the next day in a rather ominous prelude to the future of naval warfare, with the first ever naval air combat sortie carried out by a seaplane of the Wakamiya on the Kaiserin Elizabeth. It didn't accomplish much of anything, but nevertheless it made history and would set a precedent that would change naval warfare forever. By the 13th, the Japanese would show up in force, launching an attack on the German force on the outskirts of the port. They retreated, which allowed the Japanese to take much of the bay area around the port and the railway connecting it to China. They dug in for a while because of weather, continuing on the 27th with more attacks, crossing the river, separating them from the town itself. That same day, an attack was made on one of the main hill positions that the Germans had fortified, and this went about as well as you would expect. The Japanese got blasted and had their teeth kicked in and were forced to regroup. They would succeed in taking the hill after much help from their fleet, who were busy shelling the place and fucking up what few defending vessels there were. For the next month, the siege was rather conventional, with the Japanese digging in and building trenches and filling them with artillery with an ever so slight forward advance of the trench line. Slow and steady tends to win the proverbial race, and this is no more apparent than in the case of a siege. On October 17th, the German torpedo boat managed to get through the blockade and nail a Japanese cruiser, sinking it. But it couldn't get back in and had to be scuttled. In fact, every defending ship would be scuttled over the course of the next month as the noose tightened around them. Still, the attackers were getting impatient and began shelling the fuck out of the defenders on the 31st of October. Using over 100 big guns, they shelled for 7 days. Garrison did the best to fight back, but were simply overwhelmed, eventually running out of ammunition for their own big guns. On November 6th, with the Germans out of shells, the Japanese used their numerical superiority to their advantage, launching a massive attack and basically drowning the defenders in bodies, fully breaking the line and causing them to surrender the next morning, bringing the siege to an end. And if you're wondering what the British were doing all this time, the answer is absolutely fuck all. They joined in the last attack to claim partial credit, took some losses, and that was about it. As the defeated Germans watched the Japanese march through the streets of the town, they possessed a surprising amount of respect for them, seemingly willing to admit that they were bested. They had much less respect for the British when they showed up, often just not even looking at them. Despite the situation they were in, the defenders fought very well, holding out for 2 months with no hope of relief against a much superior foe, and the Japanese, being who they are, understood this, and developed a respect for the Germans as a result. Everyone just kind of pretended that the British weren't there. As for casualties, they were somewhat light by World War I standards, with the Japanese taking 733 dead and 1,282 wounded, the British taking 12 dead and 53 wounded, and the Germans losing 199 dead and 504 wounded. The remainder became prisoners and were sent to Japan for the rest of the war, where they basically did nothing because this about concluded Japanese participation in this particular conflict. As for Tsingtao itself, it went through a bit of a turbulent period of ownership. Japan occupied it for the rest of the war, but China wasn't having this, so they joined World War I on the side of the Entente, hoping to get it back. When the end rolled around and Japan was allowed to keep it, the Chinese public flipped its shit and casually had a culture-defining protest known as the May 4th movement, which set so many things in motion it should really be its own video. After this, Japan would cave after pressure from the United States, and the city would be returned to China in 1922. Japanese didn't forget this, though, and they would be back eventually.